The truth of the matter is that the UK gave away far too much for far too little in return. The Australia trade deal is not actually a very good deal for the UK. Now, the current Secretary of State at DIT obviously had no role in these particular discussions, although my honourable friend did and will recall some of the discussions that took place. But the Secretary of State was not in the Cabinet at the time, nor in any of the Cabinet committees, and the Minister today has defended, obviously, the position that was taken at the time. My position is obviously slightly different. I was in the Cabinet in 2021, and I was in this Cabinet subcommittee that argued over the Australian trade deal. For yes, there were deep arguments and differences over how we should approach this. But since I now enjoy the freedom of the backbenches, I no longer have to put such a positive gloss on what was agreed. And I hope that my honourable friend will understand my reason for doing this. And that is that unless we recognise the failures that the Department for International Trade made during the Australia negotiations, we won't be able to learn the lessons of future negotiations. And there are critical negotiations underway right now, notably on CPTPP and on Canada. And it is essential that the Department for International Trade does not repeat the mistakes it made. And so the first step is to recognise that the Australia trade deal is not actually a very good deal for the UK. It wasn't for lack of trying on my part. Indeed, as my old friend pointed out, there were things that we achieved, a special agricultural safeguard for years 10 to 15, staged liberalisation across the first decade, the protection of British sovereignty in SPS issues. It's no surprise that many of these areas were areas negotiated either exclusively or predominantly by DEFRA on behalf of the UK team. But it has to be said that overall, the truth of the matter is that the UK gave away far too much for far too little in return. What would a good agreement have looked like? Well, it would have been having enduring TRQs on beef in particular, but probably also for sheep as well. The volumes probably would have started at around 10,000 tonnes per annum, rising after a decade to around 60,000, perhaps 80,000 tonnes. That's something that could have been manageable. We did not actually need to give Australia nor New Zealand full liberalisation in beef and sheep. It was not in our economic interest to do so, and neither Australia nor New Zealand had anything to offer in return for such a grand concession. And let us not forget as well that while we are about to open our market to unbridled access for Australian beef, Australia remains one of the few countries left in the world that maintains an absolute export ban for British beef. Not a single kilo of British beef is able to be sold in Australia since they maintain a protectionist ban using the BSE episode as a sham reason for doing so. Now, the impact of full liberalisation is hard to predict. And I think the reality is that provided we maintain a ban on hormones in beef, volumes may actually remain quite low. But here is the big challenge. The CPTP negotiation that is underway could mean accession and agreement to new dispute resolution processes that will undermine the UK's sovereignty in SPS issues and actually undermine our approach when it comes to banning hormones in beef. And if there were to be some foreign court or some foreign mediation process that said, as a matter of treaty, the UK had to accept beef from Australia treated with hormones, that could change the nature of this agreement considerably. Volumes could rise significantly, perhaps to over 200,000 tonnes over time, and that would have a very severe impact on British beef. Now, I would continue. I will give way.
Actually, I wonder if the right honourable gentleman might be able to clarify this, because as I understand it, and I may be wrong on this, is that through CPTPP, the dispute mechanisms are done through the World Trade Organization. And I'm not sure that the World Trade Organization, as it currently stands, would be able to override any one of our SPS standards.
The CPTPP has provisions for its own dispute resolution. They are modelled on what happens in the WTO. But here is the thing. If we don't get the negotiation right with CPTPP, it may well undermine our ability to practice our own SPS regime and have our own independence in this area. Now, if we were to have a significant increase in Australian beef because we'd been forced by a court or a dispute resolution service to allow hormones in beef, and there have been close challenges in the past done through the WTO, then that would be intolerable, I think, for any British government. So much so that a government of the day would probably have to trigger Article 32.8 of the agreement and give 6-month notice to terminate the FTA. And it's worth remembering that, in my view, the best clause in this treaty that we have with Australia is the final clause, because it does give any UK government, present or future, an unbridled right to terminate and renegotiate the FTA at any time with just 6 months' notice. Now, many members in this House will remember that we had hours of fun in the last Parliament discussing triggering Article 50. I suspect we would prefer not to have to go back to that, but it is the ultimate and final sanction, which, as things have turned out, is quite a critical safeguard given the size of the concessions that were made to Australia in that trade deal. So what are the lessons that we should learn? The first, and I think most important, is that we should not set arbitrary timescales for concluding negotiations. The UK went into this negotiation holding the strongest hand, holding all of the best cards. But at some point in early summer 2021, the then Trade Secretary took a decision to set an arbitrary target to conclude heads of terms by the time of the G7 summit. And from that moment, the UK was on the back foot repeatedly. In fact, at one point, the then Trade Secretary asked her opposite number from Australia what he would need in order to be able to conclude an agreement by G7. And of course, the Australian negotiator very kindly set out the Australian terms, which then shaped eventually the deal. Now, we must never repeat that mistake. And the Minister and the Secretary of State, I know, right now, will be getting submissions from officials saying that we need to join CPTPP in a hurry, that if we don't do it now, then we won't join the club early enough, we won't be shaping the rules, we might miss the boat, it's a crucial part of the Pacific tilt and so on. But actually, the best thing that the Minister can do is to go back and tell Crawford Faulkner that I don't care if it takes a decade to do this agreement, we will get the right agreement. We're not ever again going to put ourselves in such a position as setting the clock against us and shattering our own negotiating position. The second lesson is that we need to look, in my view, Madam Deputy Speaker, at a machinery of government change. And I believe that all responsibility for agri-food negotiations, including relating to TRQs, should be transferred from the Department for International Trade to DEFRA, because DEFRA has superior technical knowledge in this area. It's important to remember that DEFRA never actually left the world stage. The Department for International Trade is a new creation, with people often lacking experience but doing their best to pick things up. Even during the EU era, DEFRA maintained a presence in trade negotiations, advising and informing the EU's position and dealing with matters such as market access around the globe. So DEFRA is worldly and it has deep technical knowledge in this area, and I believe that DEFRA should take full responsibility for negotiating TRQs in agri-food. The third change that I think we need to look at is strengthening the role of Parliament in scrutinising and perhaps even agreeing the negotiating mandate. Countries such as Japan, the United States and the EU all use their parliamentary processes to their advantage. I remember when we were negotiating with Japan and seeking to increase access for British cheese to Japan, Japan said, well, we would love to, but unfortunately we can't because there's a parliamentary motion that we cannot breach, and therefore we cannot retreat on this position. The UK doesn't have that at the moment. We could use Parliament and use a mandate agreed by Parliament to say to trading partners, we're not able to agree what you're asking for. But if they perceive that Crawford Faulkner calls the shots and that he'll always go through some back channel to get something agreed, well then you're not actually going to be in a very strong position. You undermine your negotiating position. Which brings me, Madam Deputy Speaker, to my final point. And look, I've always been a huge fan of the British civil service. I've never been a minister or a politician to level criticism at them. I've enjoyed 9 years of incredibly good relations with civil servants at all levels. But I do want to raise a comment about personnel within the Department for International Trade, because Crawford Faulkner, who's currently the interim permanent secretary, is not fit for that position in my experience. His approach always was to internalise Australian demands, often when they were against UK interests. His advice was invariably to retreat and make fresh concessions, and all the while he resented people who understood technical issues greater than he did. And it was perhaps something of a surprise when he arrived from New Zealand to find that actually there were probably several hundred civil servants within the UK civil service who did indeed understand trade better than he did, and he's not been very good over the years at listening to them. He's now done that job for several years. I think it would be a good opportunity for him to move on and to get a different type of negotiator in place, somebody who understands British interests better than I think he's been able to.